Hello and welcome along to today's show. If you're watching here on YouTube, then do make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like more from Unbelievable, why not subscribe to our newsletter? You can find the link with the info on today's video. Well, today on the show, we're asking, how do I make sense of Revelation? Or as an alternative title, is Revelation completely bonkers? Because the book of Revelation, it is one of the most mysterious and frankly sometimes bizarre books of the Bible, with all that talk of beasts and dragons and plagues and scrolls and trumpets and bowls of wrath and horsemen and symbolic numbers, perhaps most famously the mark of the beast, 666. Well, for Christians, of course, Revelation has been a source of endless speculation as well about the end times, what events might accompany the return of Christ. And in last week's show, I was joined by a premillennial and amillennial perspective on the end times. Well, today I'm joined by two guests, perhaps with completely different views on that sort of thing. But we're taking really a wider look at the book of Revelation in all of its strangeness. And Brett Davis has written a book on exactly that. He's a pastor out in Colorado. He's the author of See the Strange, the Gospel According to Revelation, in which he seeks to help readers understand the genre and the context that Revelation was written into, so that we can see the meaning for today and what underlies the symbolism and all that strangeness as well. Also joined on the show today by Glenn Packiam, who's also a pastor and theologian, especially in the area of worship and sacraments. His recent books include Blessed, Broken, Given, and Worship and the World to Come, Exploring Christian Hope in Contemporary Worship, which is very suitable for today's theme. And with both of their help, we're hoping to make some sense of Revelation today. So Brett and Glenn, welcome along to the show. Great to have you both join me today. Brett, let's start with you. It's an absolute pleasure to have you both. What I haven't mentioned is you both are actually pastors at the same church. So it's New Life Church in Colorado. So tell us a bit about that, Brett. How long have you been there? What's your role at the church yourself?
I've been, thank you for having us on. Yeah, I've been around New Life for about 3.5 years at this point. And my current role there is I'm an associate pastor with our Friday night congregation. New Life's actually a church of 8 different congregations in 5 different locations, speaking 3 different languages. And we've gone a little different way than a lot of churches in that all of our congregations are locally led. And so there's live preaching and teaching at all of our congregations every single weekend. It's really a team-based model. It's an incredible congregation or church and congregation to be a part of. And so my role there looks like doing basic sorts of pastor things, being with people, right. Journeying with them, coffees, lunches, in addition to writing and researching and doing some preaching too.
Cool. Glenn, you're also, I guess, at a different part of New Life Church out there. Tell us about what you've been doing. How long have you been there?
So I've been on staff for 21 years, and I guess when you stay around that long, they start to make up titles for you. So I am what they call associate senior pastor at the church, which means I do lead one of the congregations, but I also help look after or oversee our off-site congregations. So those familiar with an Anglican ecclesiology might think of parish and diocese and that sort of stuff. So I kind of help. If our senior pastor functions like the bishop, I help him by coaching and checking in on the other congregations. And I do preach and teach and lead at our downtown congregation as well. And Brett's book, See the Strange, was a wonderful resource for us. We all do the same sermon series together, and we all study together. And we did a series on Revelation during the fall of 2020, and Brett's book became a key commentary text for us.
Great. Tell us about the book, Brett. What inspired you to write on possibly the most difficult book to write on in the whole of the Bible?
So before I came to New Life, I was pastoring a small, very small church up in northwest Denver. And I actually walked our congregation through, it was near the end of my time there, I walked our congregation through, I think it was 16 weeks of walking through the book of Revelation. I tend to gravitate to the most difficult parts of Scripture, mainly because my reasoning is this. There's a lot of parts of Scripture that do seem completely bonkers, and so I guess I want to know if it is. And it turns out that like the more I dig into it, the more I discover that, man, this is some of the most compelling, beautiful, rich stuff in all of the Christian canon. And so, yeah, I walked our congregation through it. I prepared these sermons as manuscripts, and then I did something unusual. I printed out the manuscripts for the congregation because I had researched and footnoted a lot of the stuff. And there was this family that came in town and dropped into our congregation. They were in a distant part of about 3.5 hours away. But they kept emailing me, asking me for more of the manuscripts because they realized that I had done it. And so as the sermon series wound down and I stepped away from that congregation, I thought, man, this was so helpful to a lot of people, or not a lot of people, but to this family. I wonder if it could be helpful to a lot of people. And so I ended up compiling it and formatting it and editing it and illustrating it. And I'm trying to make it as hospitable as possible because it is one of the most, as you said, it's one of the most inhospitable parts of the Bible that just overwhelms and intimidates people. And I thought, how can we make a resource that will invite people into this?
Yeah, I've got it here. I don't know if this is the final cover, but this is it's got some great endorsements, including Glenn. And you got it there as well, Brett. Including Richard Borkham, who's obviously an amazing scholar and probably has written one of the best academic books out there on Revelation. I think what you're doing though is you're really trying to distill some of that into kind of something that everyone could pick up and read. Is that right, Brett?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I ended up kind of just throwing the book out to the wind and seeing if I could get anybody to read it and engage it. And wouldn't you know, Professor Bauckham was incredibly generous with his time. He emailed me back about it. He engaged it. He critiqued it some. He gave me the points where he disagreed, sharpened it a little bit. But then I thought, well, I'll ask him if he'll write the foreword to it. and he was incredibly generous, and he did, because it's still an independently published project. And so it was nice for him to lend his credibility to help the project gain some credibility.
Well, there aren't enough books on Revelation out there. In fact, this is possibly the only book specifically on Revelation I've ever read. And I found it really, really helpful, just as a way of getting into it and starting to engage with a book less often that we often kind of think, okay, I might crack open the beginning chapters, the end couple of chapters, the bit in the middle I'm not so sure about. But we'll come to all that in the course of the show. Glenn, you are also an author, and tell us a little bit about, some of your recent writing projects, because you've really been digging into the theology of worship, and your last book actually kind of ties both those things together, the kind of Christian hope to come and worship. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Worship in the World to Come with IVP Academic last year came out. I basically rewrote my doctoral research that I had done at Durham. And I had spent a lot of years as a worship leader and have a lot of affection for contemporary worship and contemporary worship songs. But I also know sometimes the critique about it is that it is not theologically rich enough. And so if it's forming us, is it forming us in a way that is good or is it not? And if you want to research that, you can't just say, well, is our worship theological? That's too broad of a question. And so I decided to narrow down on the aspect of theology that is the theology of hope, or sometimes called eschatology. And so part of the project had to be to define what is Christian hope, what is Christian eschatology. So I spent a lot of time constructing some different models. Here's hope from a psychology perspective or a cognitive perspective. Here's hope from an emotions perspective. Here's hope from the early Christian perspective. And then here's hope from kind of the current theological perspectives, N.T. Wright, Jürgen Moltmann. And then here's hope from a popular Christian, popular evangelical perspective. And then, kind of looking at the songs to say, the songs that worship leaders named as songs of hope. And I conducted research with 1,000 different worship leaders in the U.S. to name songs of hope. Then I analyzed those songs. Do they actually point to the future? What are they saying to us? And then I did some field work with 2 local churches, one in Dallas and one in Denver, to talk to congregants about your experience of hope when you come to worship. And so there were some fascinating things that came from that. I mean, the bottom line is the songs that we say are songs of hope don't say nearly enough. They don't say the kinds of things we want them to say. They don't talk about the resurrection or new creation. And yet, when Christians come to worship, they experience hope. And there's reasons for that that we can talk about. But God is maybe the main reason for that is God is kind to us. That even when our songs and liturgy don't get it all right, He communicates His presence and His hope to us in spite of it.
Well, maybe we'll dig into some of that research a bit later on in the show. Just before we get into the book, though, Brett's book, See the Strange. I'm aware you both work at New Life Church out in Colorado. It's quite well-known mega church. And it's had, some turbulent history, though. And I think you've probably been through all that, having been there that long, Glenn. Yeah. I mean, I'm particularly thinking of the shootings that happened there back in, was it 2007? Yeah.
That's
any
right.
thoughts on that? I mean, obviously, churches sort of suddenly appear in the spotlight and then come out of the news cycle and so on. But what was, tell us about that and how that impacted the church at the time, Glenn.
Yeah, we were a church that was already hurting because 13 months prior to that, we had lost our founding senior pastor in a very public scandal that made headlines around the world. And so that was a very embarrassing time. And we were a church that was trying to heal and try to dig into our roots of worship and prayer and small groups and care for one another. And then our new senior pastor, Brady Boyd, came in August of 2007 and did an incredible job reclaiming what it means to be a local church and helping us as a staff to be, get access to counseling and all of that. And 100 days into his time, so he'd barely, gotten started. 100 days into his time, this gunman came on the campus. And he was mentally troubled, and but in his mind, he was going to sort of execute vengeance because this church had a hypocritical senior pastor, the year prior, and so he was gonna, take it out on the people. That was sort of his story, and so he opened fire in the parking lot, randomly shooting at cars, and he did take the life of 2 teenage girls. Really, really tragic. And then he started walking in the hallway and opening fire, and he was apprehended by an off-duty security guard who was able to get him to stop, and then he ended up taking his own life. So a tragic day all around, and later on, the parents of the gunman and the parents of the teenage daughters actually met for lunch in Pastor Brady's office, and it was one of those uniquely Christian moments of empathy and prayer and even forgiveness among tears of 2 sets of parents, who never envisioned a day like this. But 3 days after the shooting happened on a Sunday. On a Wednesday night, Pastor Brady called the church together. He said, let's come together and worship and pray. We don't know what to do. We're going to have funerals and all this stuff, but first let's worship together. And, you don't know. Are people going to come, or are they going to be too traumatized to come? But people came, and they packed out the room, thousands and thousands of people. At the time, I was serving on the worship team, so I was on the platform. And I'll never forget, at the end of the night, we sang a song that my buddy John Egan, he's the worship pastor here, wrote called Overcome. And the chorus of it exalts Jesus, the Savior of all. And then the bridge is taken right out of Revelation 12:11. And it says, we will overcome by the blood of the Lamb, the word of our testimony, everyone overcome. And through tears and kind of like a holy, sacred defiance. And we're singing, we serve the crucified and risen Lord. And this is our confidence. This is our hope for how we can make it through a season like this.
Gosh. Well, look, we want to talk about sort of these big themes that song obviously alludes to, and that, in a sense, the Christian life is part of as well. Very often, though, it's really difficult to know where to start with Revelation, isn't it? So, Brett, maybe take us in first of all on what are maybe some of the misconceptions. Let's start there with Revelation. A lot of people will assume that a film like Left Behind is basically the movie version of Revelation, and a lot of people have specific kind of ideas about what it represents. That the symbology is to do with one world governments arising and certain events that will lead up to ultimately the return of Christ and everything else. And maybe just even before we get to that, sort of Any thoughts on the kind of type of approach that we were hearing last week on the show, the kind of those who, do argue for a kind of pre-millennial, post-millennial, whatever millennial kind of way of understanding the return of Christ and so on? Do you have any sympathy yourself for kind of looking at the Bible and trying to work out the sequence of events and how things will pan out when it comes to the return of Christ?
Of course I have. Yeah, I have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for anybody who's trying to take the scriptures that seriously, of saying, okay, what do we have here, and how do we do it justice? How do we dig into it? The question, the thing is, what we expect to hear from the Bible, from anything, actually affects what we end up actually hearing. So for the mishearing lyrics of songs might be a really good example of like Elton John's Tiny Dancer. Everybody hears Tony Danza, or lots of people. Sorry if you've never heard that before, but Tony Danza, hold me close now, Tony Danza. Yeah. Or Bon Jovi's Living on a Prayer. It doesn't make a difference if we're naked or not. I'd never heard that one until
if we
recently.
Make it or not. Yeah.
yeah, right. And so Revelation actually sounds different depending on what we're expecting to hear from it. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions that we have about Revelation as we approach it is a lot of people are expecting to hear tomorrow's news from it. We're expecting to hear, learn about the story of tomorrow's future. And that's not what Revelation is actually intending to do to us and for us. Instead of like learning the story of tomorrow's future, Revelation's actually inviting us to live in the spirit of Jesus today. And so there's a giant difference between approaching the book of Revelation as a sprawling set of like mysteries to solve or codes to crack, and thinking through like, oh man, hidden beneath this surface, I've got Christianity 201 or Christianity 301. I'm going to graduate from Christianity 101. Which is what I grew up in. I read all 12 of the Left Behind novels as a teenager. When in reality, Revelation is actually just representing in a stark, strange new way. It is re-dramatizing Christianity 101. That's what it's doing. It's saying Jesus is Lord. He's Lord over you. He's Lord over this world. He's Lord over all of the powers of darkness. And he wins in the end. Here, let me present it to you in the freshest, strangest way possible. And maybe it will hit you anew and carry not just your mind along, but your emotions along as well.
Can I jump in and say something about that? I love so much what you're saying, Brett, with the representing, because Revelation references other books of the Bible more than any other book of the Bible. Isn't that right? It has more quotes from other books of the Bible. So we shouldn't be coming to it expecting to hear something new. Rather, we should be expecting to hear the central theme of the Bible in a new way, is what you're saying. Is that right?
Bang on.
And then the thing about codes, people will say, well, hang on, there are a lot of crazy images. And Tom Wright, I think, is the one who does this. He talks about the difference between a symbol and a code. Where a code has one referent. So the beast could only be referring to one person or one thing, and so you got to crack the code. But a symbol is looser than that. It requires imagination. There are many beastly people or beastly kingdoms and that sort of thing.
I was going to say, I just wanted to pick up on that because, maybe a great place to start would just be to kind of, for those who maybe just don't have a lot of, background knowledge on Revelation, who apparently wrote this, and when was it written, and what was the circumstance, what was the kind of context? Because I think a lot of people maybe dive straight in without any of that kind of grounding knowledge that I think often helps to make sense of these texts as well. So give us a bit of that kind of background, Brett.
So, a lot of those questions are debated by scholars, but this is an ancient letter written in the latter half of the first century AD, anywhere between 70 AD and like 90, 95 AD, probably under the reign of Vespasian or Domitian. These are the Roman Caesars that this is written under. And it's very obvious, this is not in dispute, it's a letter written to Christian communities, to newly formed Jesus communities, and encouraging them, telling them to hold on. This is really obvious in chapters 2 and 3, where the letter begins with this stylized letter to 7 different churches. But the entire thing, it runs straight through of its encouragement to people who are just hanging on. You know, they're about to lose it. They're being persecuted in policy by the Roman Empire, and then on the ground in the local cultures, wherever they may happen to be, whether it's, Galatia or Laodicea or wherever. So it's a letter to encourage people, and it's written in a particular style. It's written
by John, on the island of Patmos. Yeah. He's exiled on this island of Patmos, and he's writing encouragements to these Christian communities.
Yeah, and there's debate over which John this is. Is this John the apostle of Jesus? Is this John the elder? Is this John the visionary? Which is really just a way of saying we don't know who this was, but he had a vision. Whoever he is, he's an early Christian leader who knows early Christians, and he's writing for the explicit purpose of encouraging them. And I think that's something that can get lost as we're debating these sorts of things, because whatever this thing is, it's meant to encourage people in the first century, not be just like armchair theologians speculating while we've got our cable news on in the 21st century.
And if you had to kind of label it in a particular genre of writing, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, scholars call it apocalyptic literature, which is really just kind of saying there's a number of ancient texts that all share certain things in common. There's divine revelation coming through some sort of angelic messenger, talking about current events in really highly symbolic language, using images, patterns, symbolism, to talk about God's purposes for the ultimate future and how we live in the present right now. Examples of those are things like 4 Ezra or 2 Baruch or the Book of Enoch. All of these things are public domain, and anybody can Google them and see that this is it's a particular genre of writing that's common to the ancient world. And to misunderstand that genre of writing is the equivalent, I say it in the book, it's the equivalent of what happened in the early 20th century when people heard Orson Welles' War of the Worlds being read over the radio, and they thought they were hearing a news report, but it's actually, they misunderstood the genre. The genre is science fiction.
And let's take it a step further, because to most people, when we use the word apocalyptic, Justin, they think of end of the world stuff. So they precisely think of movies like War of the Worlds or Endgame or something like this.
Apocalyptic or zombie apocalypse.
Apocalyptic means end of the world. But actually, the Greek word apocalypsis means revealing. It means to pull the curtain back. And so it's actually, this will date my age a little bit, but it's actually more like the movie The Matrix, where you take the red pill and now you see what reality as it actually is. And this is the genre of apocalyptic literature is not end of the world. The genre is, I'm going to pull the curtain back and show you what's really going on. And the reason this letter is encouraging to early Christians is because John is saying, in the midst of all that you see a dominant Rome and a weakened and persecuted church, but I'm going to pull the curtain back and show you that suffering is the victory, because suffering is the Lamb's victory, and you think this is the ruler, but the real ruler is the Lamb who was slain. And so there's a reveal. It's the take the red pill kind of moment in the Matrix.
So to that extent, does the book, in any sense, speak about the literal future and that kind of thing? Is there anything that we should take as being specific about things happening in our time or before or after our time? Because inevitably, that has been the way that the book has been interpreted for so long, even as people have recognized it spoke to its own age as well. But what about that, Brett?
Yeah, there are all kinds of parts of the Bible, not just Revelation, that make nods to gestures to an ultimate future. I mean, I'm thinking of 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, or there's a climactic chapter at the end of the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. Matthew's chapter 24 and 25 are these nods to an ultimate future. And I think in the same way, Revelation does make nods to the ultimate future, especially as we get towards the latter quarter, fifth of the book. I'm thinking specifically of chapters 19, 20, 21, and 22. They are, but these are not, in the book at one point I said this is not turn-by-turn GPS directions that are we want Siri or Alexa or whoever to give us like, okay, and then this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen. And it's much more like a directional sign, a signpost pointing and saying, this is the direction, this is where it's headed. It's headed towards Jesus dealing with evil once and for all, taking care of whatever beastly presences are in the world, whether it be empires like Rome or economic, darkness or oppression or whatever. And but Jesus is going to take care of those things, and he's going to save. I think that gets lost in a lot of the ways that Revelation is articulated. It's much more about threats and fear rather than about the goodness of Jesus, the slain Lamb who is saving the world.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back to talk more about Revelation. And maybe we'll dive into some of the specific imagery that often, which is so colourful and sometimes, so bizarre as well. And we'll maybe try and understand what some of it is pointing to. And yes, whether that is pointing to something that is literal or figurative or whatever. I've also got some questions, actually, that got sent in by listeners ahead of today's show. Maybe we can tackle one or two of those in the course of the remainder of the show. But on today's programme, we're talking about Revelation. My guests are Glenn Packiam and Brett Davis. Brett is the author of a new book. It's called See the Strange, The Gospel According to Revelation. We're talking about Revelation on Unbelievable Today. For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter. Welcome back to today's show. We're talking about Revelation today on the show, one of the most mysterious and frankly bizarre books of the Bible. But Brett Davis and Glenn Packiam are helping us to steer our way through it today, helping us to look at what it means, the context it was written into, and we've got some of your questions as well coming up on the show today. This is all because Brett's written a book recently, See the Strange, The Gospel According to Revelation. You can find out more about it with the info from today's show, and indeed to Glenn's work as well. Now, let's dive straight into one of the questions that came in on my Twitter feed, folks. Matthew Taylor, who's a friend of the show, he's a non-Christian atheist, simply asked, why should any of it be taken seriously? So much of it is utter hat stand, he says. Why not simply file it away as delusional ramblings and ignore it? Forcing yourself to study it because it's there seems like a particularly cruel self-punishment. So yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. I mean, a lot of people, when they first come to a book like this with all this strange language of dragons and beasts and, all kinds of strange things, they'll just say, the guy was on something and he wrote it down. Why are you trying to decipher it, 2,000 years later? So yeah, what's your response to that, Brett?
I'm reminded of my granddad when we went to go see Lord of the Rings back in 2001. He walked out of the movie theater shaking his head, and we had seen Fellowship of the Ring for the first time, and we were like, man, this is incredible. And he was just shaking his head, and he could have said, this is utter hat stand. This is like, what in the world did I just see? He had no idea, and because he had no conception for it. I feel like that. I respect the question so much. The longer I look at Revelation, though, I'm beginning to recognize that there's a tremendous wisdom that the church had in putting it into the Christian scriptures, because it really serves as like a climax of everything that's gone before it, particularly in the Hebrew scriptures and the Jewish scriptures. If you could indulge me just a second for extended metaphor, like this is the Bible's end game, and it feels like it's comparable a little bit to Avengers Endgame. That like if you walked into Avengers Endgame, and I'll try to keep the spoilers light for anybody who hasn't seen it, you could ask a lot of questions. You'd have questions about like, why is that Thor? Why is he depressed? And who are all these people? And what's up with the talking raccoon? I have no idea what's going on. And they're actually, in this movie, they're time traveling. They're weaving their way backwards through stories that that we've already seen in movies. But every day, this is not like elite scholars that are studying Avengers Endgame. Everyday audience members could pause the movie at any point in it with any character on screen, and they could do a deep dive into the backstory of this person and say, oh, well, that's Black Widow, and that talking tree, that's Groot. It's worth recognizing that in a world before social media, before movies, before Marvel comics, the Jewish scriptures were actually a lot of people's stories. They were the deep dives that people told and retold and thought about again and again. And so it does seem bizarre and absolute nonsense from the outside, like my granddad with Lord of the Rings. But once you start getting inside the story, you recognize, oh, there's actually an inner genius at work here.
Yeah, and the symbols or the images, they seem bizarre, but they're not random. So they're not like somebody had a bad acid trip and they're just sort of random images. The images were significant, and this is why what we were saying earlier, Revelation draws on imagery from the rest of Scripture. So it's difficult for a person who's unfamiliar, particularly with the Old Testament, to come into it and say, well, wait a minute, well, what's the deal? Why does it say in Revelation 21 that the new heaven and the new earth, there's no sea? Why is God not like water? Is God anti-ocean? And you say, no, wait a minute. Actually, the sea was quite a picture of chaos, and the gods, the monsters were in the sea, and so when Revelation 21 says at the end of it all there'll be no sea, it's a beautiful metaphorical way of saying the monsters are gone. You don't have to be scared at night. There are no monsters under the bed, so to speak. So these images mean something, but they take a little bit of work.
The rich source of these images that are a lot of times unfamiliar to us is from the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, and from popular stories and culture of the ancient world. And so there are places where it's like Revelation 12, where there's the story of a boy being born to a woman, and there's this great sea monster dragon that's about to swallow up the child. That's as familiar to the ancient world, the story of Apollo's birth and Leto, the son of Zeus, being threatened by the dragon, and it's actually being retold so that everybody in the ancient world would say, oh my goodness, I see what he's doing there. He's just taken a story that's as familiar to us as Harry Potter,
Superman,
or Star Wars, or Use the Force, or with just a couple of words. He's evoked a whole lot of imagery, and he's infused it with imagery from the Jewish scriptures, and it's all revolving around this human being in living memory, Jesus of Nazareth, and exalting him as to the highest possible level, and saying he is Lord and he is going to take care of every dragon, monster, all of the darkness in the world.
Yeah. I mean, give us a sense then of sort of what's being described in the course of, especially that sort of, the large part of the book where we're kind of, there's lots of things happening. There's a scroll, and no one can open this scroll except the one who is able to, and it's got 7 seals on it, and gradually each of these seals is released, and various terrible things happen with each seal that's released, and there's judgments and plagues and 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and what's going on with all of that stuff, because are we supposed to say this is referring to something? I mean, so for instance, what Coffee and Chill gets in touch on the Twitter to say what parts are symbolic and what parts are more literal. How do we decipher what was applicable during the time versus a future application? So it's coming back to this question: is there, is any of that stuff that's being described obviously very symbolically, but is it sort of talking about some events that will happen? When it talks about a fourth of the earth experiences some type of devastation, then a third of the earth, is it saying something will happen to the earth, or what? So let's start with that kind of stuff in the book.
Well, let me say some general comments, and I'll let Brett fill in the details here. I think what's helpful about recognizing this is that, first of all, the scrolls that are sealed, in one sense, is a picture of the meaning of history. Is life random? Is history random? Can anyone sort things out in the end? Can anyone make these seemingly random events become part of a cohesive narrative? And the idea of Jesus being the one that opens the scroll is that he can determine the meaning of history. So, to the debates of, is history a linear progress? No, it doesn't seem like it is. Or is history a random set of occurrences? No. But Jesus can make sense of it. He is the key that makes sense of all of history. And then with some of the stuff about the four horsemen and all of that, I don't take it as, okay, these are literal things and they're going to happen in the sequence. What I do see it as, these are the things that devastate the earth. So in a way, it's helping us name evil. And this is a thing that we have an interesting relationship with in the West. After an event like 9/11, you have President Bush saying, "Okay, we've got to take on the forces of evil," and so we use the word evil sometimes very definitively. But there are other places where we're not so sure about naming evil. How else do we talk about evil? Do we talk about evil in terms of greed and consumption? And so some of these pictures are of grain being sold at an exploitative price. So if you look closely, there's exploitative economics. There are some natural disasters, but there are also some things that are violence and war. And Revelation is trying to unveil, again, pull the curtain back and say all these things are part of what is evil and what is doing damage to God's good creation.
Yeah, to Coffee and Chill's question, I would say that almost all of it is symbolic. There's a flat-footed wooden reading of Revelation. Even most of the time, we're interpreting the symbols, even if we don't recognize that we're interpreting the symbols. Something like, we're like, oh, well, obviously it's not talking about the sea right there, like water. Or obviously the sword coming out of the mouth is not, Jesus being like a circus act and pulling, a sword out of his mouth. I think the question is, like, what is the best way of making sense of what symbols, how all the symbolism works. To go back to the previous question by the friend of the show, I forget his name. It's funny. History itself is bonkers. That's part of what Revelation is speaking to. It's not just Revelation that we have a tough time making sense of. It's this gigantic mystery that all of us keep waking up to every single day, and we look at the news and we say, "What is going on?" And this document is claiming to have insight into saying, okay, this is the ultimate meaning of history, can be deciphered, not by power, not by monsters, not by empires, but by self-giving love that we find unveiled in Revelation 5. So if we can get specific with the details of the story if you want.
What I'd love to dig into is the fact that, a lot of people do put a lot of store in some of the specific symbols, some of the specific numbers as well. There's quite a few different kinds of numbers in Revelation, and inevitably, a whole industry has gone to work on those in terms of, well, if you do this and multiply it by 7 and divide it by 8, and, you'll end up with the year 2009 or whatever is the year that Christ will return, and so on. I mean, let's go to another question or two on numbers. So, for instance, one well-known number is 144,000. David Bradley asks, what is the 144,000 referring to? Because there's apparently at one point in Revelation 144,000 saints who are sealed in some special way. Now, I know that, for instance, the Jehovah's Witnesses make a lot of this, and they have developed a whole doctrine out of that around a specific number of people who have some specific place in the heavenly realms and this sort of thing. Okay, let's take that specific number then. What's your take on that, Brett, and then we'll see what Glenn has to say.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the 144,000 shows up it's in Revelation 7, and it's actually part of the seals. Is what 144,000 comes in the middle of. There is this. Let's back up and get to the seals. There's the book of Revelation begins with 7 letters to 7 churches. And then at the very end of the last one, Jesus says, I stand at the door and knock. And then suddenly, in the beginning of chapter 4, John sees an open door, and he's drawn through this door into, it seems like he's drawn behind the curtain of the universe, of all reality, backstage, and he sees heaven. He sees the command center of the universe. But he has a nervous breakdown while he's in heaven. In the beginning of chapter 5, because he suddenly spies this scroll, this mysterious book of some sort, that nobody can open, and it's sealed with 7 seals. So the good news that's proclaimed to him by one of the 24 elders around the throne, which seems to be a picture of 12 and 12. It's the picture of God's people, past and present.
12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples of Jesus. Yeah,
precisely. The good news that is given to him by the people of God is there is a lion who can open up this scroll that seems to be the meaning of history, where it's all going. And then he looks, and he doesn't see a lion. He sees a lamb, a butchered lamb, a slaughtered lamb, that seems to be in the middle of heaven, in the middle of the throne room. And this lamb that is slaughtered begins opening the scroll. He begins moving towards reading and making sense of history. And and he goes through exactly what Glenn has already mentioned. Like, there's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It seems to be the horrors of history, things that are in the way of us understanding how the universe works or what history means. The bonkersness of the world are these seals. And then when he gets to between the 6th and the 7th, there's 104. Well, the 6th seal, actually, there's a hardness of human heart that seems to be present. And people do not want, they're calling the Lamb awful and oppressive, and who can survive the wrath of the Lamb, and he's just terrible. And they say, who can stand? And the 144,000, I guess I want to make the point that the 144,000 are part of a narrative. They're part of a story. It's not just something to rip out of context. The 144,000 are actually the answer to the question of who can stand that happens at the end of chapter 6 in Revelation. And it's like heaven is answering, well, there's a whole lot of people that can stand.
That can stand, yes.
And it's a symbolic, if we couldn't pick up on it, it's a symbolic picture of the people of God throughout history that can and want to be sealed, to be named, claimed by God. It's borrowing images from Ezekiel, and it's using... go for it.
No, well, Brett, say something about the math, because the way that the numbers work, it's not like in English or our numerals where it's 144,000. Isn't it 12 times 12 times 1,000? So again,
totally.
the idea there is this is an exponential increase of the people of God. So the idea is the people of God in the past, as you said, the people of God in the present, from Old Covenant to New Covenant, from Israel to the Jews plus Gentiles, basically, right. Jews and Gentiles times a gajillion. So the way that numbers work is it's not a precise figure like 1,000. It's actually a symbolic number in much the same way that we would say the phrase a bajillion,
And I was going to say, in that respect, at least there is some agreement with some of what was said in last week's show, which is that one of the guests at least said, 1,000 doesn't necessarily represent a literal 1,000 years. It represents a period of time. Now whether again you say that this is actually meant to be something in the future or whatever is a separate question, I suppose. But yes, that's something you obviously want to stress in the book, that we're not meant to read these numbers as sort of specific numbers that we can sort of do some kind of calculation in terms of years and so on with. It's much more about sort of giving a sense of a great number or a never-ending number or whatever it might. I suppose it's a bit like Jesus, when he responds to how many times should I forgive my neighbor, he says 70 times 7, and he doesn't mean whatever the multiplication of that number is. He means
490.
There isn't an end. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, okay, another one here then, another number, possibly the most famous number in Revelation. Joseph, on Twitter asks, does 666 actually refer to the Emperor Nero? Now, just give us the context again, Brett, of where this famous number crops up in the book of Revelation, and what is there a code here that we're meant to decipher? Because this might be at least one bit in Revelation where there is actually a code that's not actually too hard to decipher it, you reckon, in the book. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's great. So just to continue maybe the story of Revelation and where it's gone. Sure. The 144,000 are the people that are claimed by the Lamb. This is chapter 7, and then there's a question that arises in chapter 8 of what's actually arisen in the fifth seal of. How long is God going to let the world go bonkers? There's so much terrible stuff going on. And the answer comes in chapter 8 in the form of 7 trumpets. They seem to be God's answer to the question of what will we do with evil? Well, we're going to blow trumpets like back in Jericho, and we're going to knock down every empire that's oppressing not just people of God, but even the innocent, is what it says in chapter 18. So the trumpets sound through chapters 8 and 9. And then finally, we actually arrive at chapter 10 with an angel bringing, it seems to be the same scroll that's been opened by the Lamb, and in another borrowing an image from Ezekiel, gives it to John to eat. He eats it. And then in chapter 11, if you can get this, man, you can follow a lot of Revelation. He eats it at the end of chapter 10, and in chapter 11 he immediately starts to tell the meaning of history. He immediately starts to tell what can make sense of all of this, and he tells a really compact story about witnesses being trampled by oppressed. Yeah.
It's a compact retelling of everything in one short kind of story. And is that where the 666 comes in there, Brett?
Well, no, that's what I was going to say. Is people are trampled by a kind of monstrous group of people, and then chapter 12 pivots and starts retelling this story of trampling and faithful witness again and again and again throughout the rest of the book. In chapter 12, it's a dragon with a woman pursuing the people of God embodied in a woman. In chapter 13, there's beasts coming out of the sea. It's borrowing imagery from the book of Daniel. And this is probably the exception that proves the rule on codes and codes being cracked, because chapter 13, verse 18 says, "This calls for wisdom." So he's talking to his ancient readers. "Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast," this terrible monster that's come out of the sea, like from an image from Daniel. "It is the number of a man, and his number is 666, which in the ancient world, it's kind of like the equivalent of Roman numerals today. X and L and V and I, they all have number values associated with them. And in the ancient world, you could play games with these numbers. This is before Twitter and social media and all that. This is what people did for fun. It's actually like in the ruins of a city, you have, there's graffiti that they found that says, "I love the girl whose number is," and it gives the number of her name. This is a popular level thing that people did, and the 666 actually corresponds to the Hebrew letters of Neron Caesar, or Caesar Nero. And so, that's the story behind 666. It's trying to, so the answer is, yes. It does refer to Caesar, and yet he doesn't, or to Caesar Nero, and yet he doesn't come out and say Nero, because there's a whole lot of Neros that are ruling throughout history, that are leading the Third Reich, that are throwing people in ovens, and anybody who fits the bill of falling short of 7 in triplicate is another way of seeing it. Falling short of perfection again and again and again. It's doing double duty. This is a very sophisticated piece of literature. And so, yes, it's Nero, and it's anybody who's Nero-like.
But people have obviously taken this number of the beast and ran with it in all kinds of ways, and that's probably when I was a teenager first ran into sort of some of the theories around this. Oh, they're going to implant us with chips, and that's the number of the beast that people will buy and sell through, and anyone who hasn't done that will be kind of the special ones. Or I mean, do you guys just say no? None of that. Is that all just contemporary kind of readings into some things which owe more to I don't know, Tim LaHaye and whatever than reality?
Yes, I mean the short answer is yes. I would dismiss all of that. We're meant to think more creatively about it. Prophetic literature invites us into the story, and it requires imagination. It requires participation through imagination. So if what Brett is describing, this beast is the triple imperfection, then anytime we live with that mark in us, in order to succeed in business, for example, so instead of saying you need a microchip to buy groceries, it's in order to succeed in business and economics, you have to be beastly about it. You're living under the way of the beast, not the way of the lamb.
Yeah, I've
so
seen
a businessman who exploits. Yeah.
Facebook is the place to go if you want these kinds of theories. By the way, they'll swap around the numbers in the latest COVID vaccine, and all of that kind of thing. It'll turn out to, but maybe we've got time for just one more thing before we go to another break. Because a couple of people want to ask about some of the pretty gory imagery associated with Jesus in the book, and this maybe comes a bit later on in Revelation. We're not going to get time we're grazing the surface on all of this, so go read the book if you want the full treatment. That's my advice. But but
Brett's book and the book of Revelation, both books.
Absolutely, yes, read them both bestsellers. Benjamin Hinks asks, how should the Gospels and Revelation work together in portraying Jesus? Should the imagery of a warrior Jesus cause us to question the validity of the imagery because it's very unlike the Jesus presented in the Gospels? Or should we see Revelation imagery as a fuller picture? And here's a related question from Timmins Ingle, and he references specifically Revelation 19:13. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. Now, does that refer to Jesus being covered in his own blood due to having been a sacrifice, or because he's been wielding a bloody sword? Some theologians like Greg Boyd say the former. Some Calvinists I've heard say this is proof that the nice Jesus of the Gospels comes back as a violent warrior in Revelation. So, yeah, how do we take this imagery of Jesus drenched in blood?
Great question.
And apparently it looks, on a plane reading, arguably, that he's slaughtered a lot of people, because it's like there's blood everywhere at one point in Revelation. So what's going on, Brett?
Yeah, wonderful question. I would say, first of all, on the general question of the Gospels and Revelation, I would say that the Gospels are, they are self-evidently pointing us to the character of Jesus, to the character of the historical person of Jesus, and they give us a cohesive, comprehensive picture of what Jesus looks like and how he approaches the marginalized, the broken, those who are in need, and how he treats sinners. He doesn't condemn them. He says, "Go and sin no more," and yet he gives his life as a ransom for many. That is the character of Jesus, and any approach that we take to Revelation that makes Jesus seem like he is, I joke in the book, but it's actually pretty true, that makes Jesus sound more like Bruce Wayne, that he's gone off to heaven somewhere and then he's come back with dark vengeance and he's more like Batman, and that makes Jesus seem like he's psychologically like changed, or that he's bipolar or got multiple personalities. This should give us a clue that we are that when the Gospels and Revelation conflict or seem to conflict, we probably aren't reading Revelation correctly, especially since the introduction, the climactic moment of Revelation 5 is a slaughtered lamb sharing the throne of heaven. It is one who has given their life as a ransom for many, in the words of Mark. And so which leads into the question of Jesus appearing in Revelation 19. Scholars evangelical scholars will go back and forth on whether or not this is Jesus covered in his own blood or covered in the blood of people that he is about to kill. I would say that is a moment where what you're expecting to find, you're going to find. And if you are coming to the text assuming that Jesus actually could be a cage fighter and that he might deliver body blows to sinners rather than dining with them, then you're probably going to find it. But there's the evidence, not just on a character level of Jesus, but on even the sequence of the narrative there in Revelation 19. Jesus is showing up covered in his own blood in a nod to Genesis 49:11 and Isaiah 63, the first three verses of Isaiah 63. And what John seems to be doing is borrowing this imagery, and he's subverting it and saying, this is the conqueror who arrives to the battle already covered in blood, seems to be his own, and through his own blood we will overcome. That's the theme of Revelation.
That's the theme.
Is the conquering comes not by crucifying others, but by taking the crucifixion on ourselves for the sake of others.
Well, we're going to go to a break. Thank you so much. It's such an interesting show today as we've been looking at Revelation, getting to grips with what is often one of the most mysterious and hard to understand books of the Bible, and being able to squeeze some of your questions in as well that came in on our social media this past week. My guests today are Brett Davis and Glenn Packiam, and we'll be back with the final part of our discussion in just a moment.
In the United Kingdom just today we passed 100,000 people who've been killed by the virus. I'm not the one here who is claiming that this is being supervised, that somebody is watching this, somebody knows that this is occurring, and somebody's allowing it to occur.
We're in no position to say definitively there is no morally justifiable reason for this particular evil, because we need a godlike perspective on all of space and all of time in order to make that claim.
Welcome back to the final part of today's discussion. My guests are Glenn Packiam and Brett Davies, and Glenn's got a couple of books out recently, Blessed, Broken, Given, and also Worship and the World to Come, Exploring Christian Hope in Contemporary Worship. If you want to find out more about him, go to his website, glennpackiam.com. That's Glenn with two N's and Packiam with a CK in the middle, but just go to the show links and you'll find it. BrettDavis.org, easier to spell, BrettDavis.org, for Brett and his book, which we've been talking about at some length today, which is called See the Strange, and it's all about the book of Revelation. So before we come back to Brett, Glenn, tell us a little bit about some of this research you've been doing. Your most recent book was essentially, a distillation of your thesis in this whole area of how contemporary Christian worship deals with issues around eschatology and Christian hope and so on. In fact, you did a bit of a survey across about 1,000 worship leaders about how they perceive, the whole issue of eschatology and what kind of theology they bring to that. Tell us about the question you asked and what came back.
Well, there's an interesting history of how our picture of the end times, or I should say our picture of the hope of what will happen at the end of it all has gotten truncated over time. The first 400 years or so of Christian history, when people talked about the end, they talked about redemption, not just of the individual, but redemption of the cosmos, the redemption of creation. And Augustine sort of is the first to sort of, be metaphorical about the millennium. But that's okay. That's not immediately a problem. But then it starts to really thin out. And by the time you get to the Reformation, there's quite a bit of emphasis on the soul being saved. And the hope of a new earth, shows up every now and again. But it's about redemption of people, not redemption of creation. And then in America, we have these great awakenings that happen in the 1800s or so. And there's this sort of post-millennial thing where there's going to be a period of perfection. And that almost was... it was a way of saying, well, let's not worry about creating an ideal society. That will come. Let's just worry about getting souls saved so they can be part of that ideal society. And then it takes a turn in the 1900s where you kind of have this premillennialism, where there's this apocalypticism, where we've got to get everybody saved because the world is a sinking ship kind of thing. And so you get the D.L. Moody stuff, you get the Billy Graham stuff. And this end times fervor actually begins to drive evangelism. But the end times fervor is all about a world that is a sinking ship and a house that's on fire and people that need to be rescued from it. So when I set out to survey these worship leaders, I wanted to know, how do they think about Christian hope? What is it? So I gave them 4 sentences, and I said, choose the sentence that brings you the most hope, or rank them 1 through 4, and then we'll see. And so one of the sentences was, God will set it right one day. That's what I might call a new creation view. The other sentence was, God will explain it to me one day. I call that the explanation view. And then the third one was, God will get me out of here one day. That's the evacuation view. And then the other one is, God will make it up to me one day. That's the compensation view. Now, I didn't reveal to them what I was calling them. I just gave them these 4 statements, and I asked them to rank them 1 through 4. Well, the good news is, the one that ranked number 1 with the highest percentage was, God will set it right one day. So kind of a renewal of creation sort of idea. But the troubling thing, and I say this as a convictional charismatic, I'm unashamedly charismatic in our practice and all of that, but charismatics had the highest percentage who chose evacuation, not as their number 1, but it had the most amount of selection came up by charismatics. And I think that says something where we could look at the sources of Christians today who emphasize maybe a bit of the rapture thing or a bit of the escapist view. And sometimes it does seem to come from these Pentecostal charismatic views. And I wonder if that's because sometimes we want to tap into the spiritual as a means of escaping the physical. And in fact, that's what we think is going to happen at the end of it all anyway.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, as you well know, N.T. Wright and other theologians of that ilk have been quite instrumental in pushing back against that kind of view, that the kind of, it's all about basically saving souls to get them into heaven, and the earth will burn and so on. So in your view, do you feel like that kind of recapturing of that original vision, and we'll talk about the revelation aspect of this as well in a moment, but of a new earth, new heavens, a recreation, that we're not just sort of abandoning it and going somewhere else, that we're actually part of a project to bring that new creation, that new kingdom on earth. Do you feel like that's is coming back now, and is it coming back in our worship songs? I suppose, have you got evidence that it is in that way?
It is coming back. It's not coming back with the sort of mainstream force that we would hope. When I asked worship leaders to name the songs that they consider songs of hope, they had very little about resurrection and new creation. In fact, they were, in a very puzzling way, were quite a bit about the present tense and about the experience of God's presence here with me now. So even though what I discovered is worship leaders knew how to say the right thing, so that's progress. They were able to say, no, it's about new creation. It's about God making it right. But the thing that we're drawn to is this sort of in the moment experience sort of thing. So what I think pastorally is people don't really know why it matters. Why does it matter if I believe that God's going to make everything new versus God's going to get me out of here? And I think of this scenario of, imagine that you're a kid on the playground and you're being bullied. The one view of, God's going to just take me to heaven when I die is that Dad's going to come to the playground, see the bully, and just say, hey, get in the car, Johnny, and we'll get out of here, and I'll go take you for an ice cream. Well, that's nice, but it doesn't deal with the bully. The view that Revelation gives us is God's going to arrive in his car. He's going to drive out the bully. He's going to renovate the playground, and he's going to say, now let's have a party here. And that's a much better vision of the Redeemer making good use of the creation that he made.
Yeah. Brett, again, is it one of these things where people will come with their perspective to Revelation and lay it on it? So those who kind of do buy into a kind of evacuation theology, as Glenn put it, they'll see that, and those who come with a restoration, recreation theology, they'll see that as well.
I think so. Unfortunately, the one thing that I say in the book, and I want to say here as we're ending, is I don't think any of us can say definitively that we've arrived at the correct reading of Revelation. What we can do is we can keep looking at Jesus. Historically, we can look at the life, death, resurrection of Jesus and say, this isn't the correct reading of Revelation, but this is a faithful reading of Revelation that is consistent with his character and also runs through, it rhymes with the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. And so to extend Glenn's metaphor for just a second, there's something to be said, and to piggyback on the worship, there's something to be said for in this metaphor, Dad showing up, and somehow in the midst of all of this, Revelation is saying that he's taking the black eye and maybe the bloody lip, and he's actually taking these things that have been inflicted in the world, and Jesus is using these things to transfigure and transform the world. There's the worship song that worship just pervades Revelation. And there's one song in particular in Revelation 15 where it says that they sing, the people who have arrived near new creation, they are singing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, but they're singing it, that's verse 3, they're singing it verse 2, on the other side of a sea. This is evoking Exodus 15. But it's a sea mingled with fire is what it is. And so they have crossed through, these people. They're explicitly named as the people who are slain by the beast, by the 666 one. And yet their trials and tribulations, and this is good news to anybody in the first century and to every century.
All of us, yeah.
That Jesus doesn't waste our wounds. He doesn't waste our suffering. He actually transforms them, and they will be they will be made like the wounds of Jesus and become the fodder through which the playground will be renovated.
Yeah. I love what you said about look at Jesus. Again, the first verses of Revelation say this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. This is a book, a letter that reveals Jesus Christ. So it's not a book that reveals the end times. This is a book that reveals Jesus Christ. So Brett has talked about how it reveals the cruciform life, the way of the Lamb, that we are to try to live faithful perseverance, faithful endurance, a faithful suffering. That's the message to the church. That's by meditating on the crucified Jesus. But hope is when we meditate on the resurrected Jesus. And resurrection is not progress. Resurrection does not emerge from possibilities that are latent in a corpse. Resurrection comes when all possibilities have ended, when it's over. And then a voice comes from beyond, not a voice from within. A voice comes from beyond and says, arise. And so resurrection is the very thing we're supposed to meditate on for hope in the book of Revelation, to say, even though you are slaughtered, even though you are martyred, even though it looks you have lost, they don't get the last word. The one who raised Jesus Christ gets the last word, and he will raise you up in the end.
Yeah, I love it. And for those who are only listening on podcast and not watching the video, Brett is just high-fiving and agreeing in all kinds of visual ways with everything Glenn is saying here throughout this. I got to tell you guys, so my church recently did a 24-hour Bible reading kind of marathon for charity. We did it all live streamed online, YouTube and Facebook and everything. And we were due to, as we approached the end of the New Testament, we were going to have a local radio station kind of take the feed and just hear 30 seconds of it because they were going to do a little report on it. And I was just praying we weren't in one of those bits of Revelation about, the whore of Babylon and the beasts. And I was just thinking, this is just going to confirm all their worst fears about wacky Christians and their Bible. And I was really hoping we might have got all the way to like Revelation 21 and the nice bits, about the New Jerusalem and wiping away every tear and that kind of thing. As it happens, I'm glad to, in fact, we got all the way through the Bible, the New Testament by that point. So we'd started on Psalms already by the time we were finishing. But, so we didn't have the problem. But that, obviously this is the bit we often, people hardly ever, if we're honest, like preach on the kind of the stuff we've really been talking about in Revelation here. If it comes up in a sermon, the bit I always hear is Revelation 21, the New Jerusalem, because it's kind of it sums up, it's the nice ending, if you like, of the story, isn't it? But do we have to have gone through all that stuff to appreciate, Revelation 21 and 22, Brett? What's your advice to preachers when they come to trying to do justice to this book?
Well, I think it's again a case of keep staring at Jesus and gazing at Jesus. What comes to mind is, Romans 8:3 or 4, that God condemned sin in the flesh of Jesus, that there's a condemnation of evil that I think we could all agree that is needed. And that's ultimately what the pictures in Revelation are pointing us towards, is a God. He wouldn't be a good God if he looked at the horrors of history and the horrors of like things happening. If he saw, the most current event right now is apparently there's a collapsed apartment complex or condominium in the state of Florida in the United States that if God didn't look at people who are negligent there and say, no, that matters, and somehow in his providence, in his power, in his wisdom say, that matters, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to sort things out. And yet this God is also the God of mercy. This God who's sorting the world out, sorting me out, who's banishing my evil, is also the God who says, I want you and I love you. And so that's ultimately what Revelation is pointing us towards, is that the character in Revelation is the nations that you see this in. The nations side with Satan, they side with the dragon, they are awful, they're despicable, and yet at the end of Revelation, in this new city, they're bringing their glories into this new city. And it's the sign of hope that somehow the church, embodying the crucified and resurrected life of Jesus, this love that death cannot conquer, when that gets unleashed on the world, it has a transforming effect on even those who we might have written off, the nations who have sided with the dragon himself, and they end up being in the New Jerusalem. It's a tremendously optimistic book in that way.
You mentioned Lord of the Rings earlier, Brett. Tolkien had this phrase, a eucatastrophe. Are you familiar with this? Where he coined this phrase where there's a catastrophe and then all of a sudden the unexpected gift or Thanksgiving occasion, sort of this interruption out of nowhere. And that's, again, resurrection is not the inevitable end to the story. Revelation does not tell us a story of upward progress and an inevitable journey toward this New Jerusalem. So if we skip all the dark, muddly, discouraging, depressing bits in the middle, we will be in danger of imagining that say yes to Jesus and life will be up and to the right until you go on to glory in heaven. That's not it at all. Life will be a spiral of chaos that includes all of the evil that this world is racked with. But in the end, God will out of nowhere bring redemption and hope and new creation.
Great to have you guys on the show today. Thank you so much for what's been a fascinating little tour through Revelation. I certainly feel like I am a lot more confident with this book of the Bible, having read your book, Brett. So thank you for it. It's called See the Strange, the Gospel according to Revelation. And I'll make sure there's a link from today's show and also to Glenn as well. So do check out the links from today's programme. But for the moment, Brett and Glenn, thank you so much for being with me on the show today.
Thank you so much.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.